Special interests have unlimited time and money to figure out new ways to spin us while cloaking their role.
She still had cancer. We were told, sorry, we've done everything we can. Now she's going to die, probably within a couple of months. My wife and I, choosing not to accept that, started reading. The first book I picked up, the third chapter, discussed Dr. Brzezinski. As you may guess, I have some expertise in fraud. In fact, I'm quite certain there are enough attorneys in the room that I could be vordeered as an expert in fraud. And I conducted my own investigation. I have no doubt the man is not a fraud. I have no doubt that he does what he does out of earnest belief that his medicine works. And now you're in a position to judge for yourselves whether it works or not. But it's well established by the FDA that it's non-toxic. 18 months later, we took my daughter off the Neoplaston. She had not died. She had no signs of tumor. She remained free for 18 months of cancer. Within a month, the cancer was widespread in her brain. We put her back on Brzezinski's. By the way, at the objections of our doctors, for some reason felt that it had failed her. We put her back on. Within 9 weeks, the tumor was completely gone. She died last July of neurological necrosis. Her brain fell apart from the radiation. The autopsy showed that she was completely cancer-free. Out of 52 cases of that disease ever, no one died cancer-free, just Chrissy. So she didn't die of a terminal illness. She died of my inability to care for her properly, and she died from bad advice. She died because there's a government institution that disseminates false information and is not looking out for the welfare of the people. You know, ladies and gentlemen, I swore an oath 11 years ago, and I think most of us in this room swore it at one time or another, to uphold the Constitution. It says life right in the beginning.
Every cancer has a defect in oxygen respiration. So we know that's the primary cause. And that's what Otto Warburg said back in the last century. He said the primary cause of cancer is the defect of respiration followed by compensatory fermentation. And that's exactly what our research has proven, that Otto Warburg in large part was correct on describing the origin of cancer. Problem with Warburg, he never morphed that into a therapeutic strategy to treat patients in the clinic, but he defined what the nature of the disease was. He just didn't exploit it for managing cancer.
I've heard of the Warburg effect, which is obviously named after him. What is that? Can you describe that for us?
Yeah, well, it's the use of continued production of fermentation waste product, which is lactic acid. When you take in glucose, see, if you take in glucose in your body, like, I'm not saying glucose doesn't cause cancer. Glucose is a facilitator of tumor growth if you were to have cancer. High levels of glucose create systemic inflammation. Inflammation damages respiration in the cell. The Warburg effect is the continued use of fermentation continued fermentation with lactic acid production in the presence of oxygen. So why does the cancer cell continue to ferment and produce lactic acid in the presence of oxygen? Because its respiration is damaged or deficient. And the damage to the deficiency is in the structure of the cell called the mitochondrion. The mitochondrion is an organelle inside the cell that generates the energy that we need for the function of those cells, the function of our body. Cancer cells have defects in that organelle, leading to a fermentation. And when the fermentation replaces the use of oxygen, the cell loses its growth control and grows dysregulated. And the organelle that controls the stable, differentiated state is that organelle, the mitochondrion. So when it gets damaged or deficient, the cell starts to go back to its default state, the way it was 2.5 billion years ago. And as long as there's fermentable fuels for that cell, it's going to continue to grow.
Fascinating. So glucose doesn't cause cancer per se, although when it's chronically elevated, it can lead to the damage that will ultimately cause cancer. But once you have cancer,
we all have to deal with entropy. Maintaining order and energy efficiency is what the mitochondrion in our body does. So healthy mitochondria maintain order and discipline within the cells. Living on the planet years and decades, wears down on those organelles. And by entropy, the second law of thermodynamics, they eventually lose their capacity to maintain the differentiated state, and you die from old age. Cancer is accelerated entropy. So what you have now is disordered cells, but they're growing out of control using a fermentation mechanism. And that ends up causing more entropy and ends up killing you. Now, of course, the treatments that we use, toxic chemicals and radiation and all this kind of crazy stuff, that just knocks the crap out of your body. So you're taking all your healthy cells now are being significantly damaged by the treatments to stop the proliferative growth of the tumor cells, right? So these tumor cells are growing out of control. So now we need to poison the patient to kill the proliferating tumor cells, but knocking the crap out of our normal system in order to kill a few. Those tumor cells can't grow without glucose and glutamine. So and if they can't burn fatty acids or ketones, the fatty acids and ketones make our normal cells very, very healthy. So we target the fermentable fuels while raising the ketones in our body to keep the rest of the cells super healthy. And then we can slowly degrade the cancer without toxicity to the rest of the body.
Dr. Bruce Cohen is the director of neurologic oncology at the prestigious Cleveland Clinic.
The only explanation is that it shrunk because of the therapy Paul has received.
He confirmed Dr. Brzezinski's results on Paul.
7 years that we've had Paul, and he's been healthy, and I owe it to this man. And there's no way that I'd ever be able to thank him enough for what he's done for us.
Today, that boy, Paul Michaels, and his anxious family sit in the courtroom with other patients.
Undeterred by the 1993 ruling, the Texas Medical Board took Dr. Brzezinski to a higher district court. Of course, this time, they knew they couldn't raise any issues about whether or not his treatment was effective.
The Texas State Board of Medical Examiners, which has fought to suspend Dr. Brzezinski's license because his treatments have never been approved, says, quote, the efficacy of anti-neoplastons in the treatment of human cancers is not of issue in these proceedings.
It takes a bureaucrat to come up with that idea, because a layman, that would really be the question.
Well, Dr. Brzezinski has won his latest round in court. The medical examiner's order was reversed, but that is not expected to be the end of his trouble with the state of Texas.
The Texas Medical Board took this case all the way to the Texas State Supreme Court, leaving the Texas Medical Board completely unsuccessful in their efforts to remove his medical license. So, if efficacy was not an issue, and Dr. Brzezinski wasn't breaking any laws, then why would the Texas Medical Board continue on with this empty pursuit? Well, it was eventually realized, even by the mainstream press, that the Food and Drug Administration had been pressuring the Texas Medical Board to continue trying to take away Dr. Brzezinski's medical license.
For this story, we wanted to talk to the FDA about its policies and procedures. The agency did agree to talk to us on background where it wouldn't be quoted, but it repeatedly refused our requests for on-camera interviews.
While they were busy pressuring the Texas State Medical Board to try to revoke Dr. Brzezinski's medical license, they were even busier trying to revoke Dr. Brzezinski completely from society by trying to place him in prison. On March 12, 1976, FDA Bureau of Drugs Director Richard Kraut states in the cancer letter, when anyone other than large institutions ask permission to conduct clinical trials, you want harsh regulations. Sometimes we say it is proper to hinder research. And once these guidelines were adopted, the FDA would consider itself bound by them. In 1982, Kraut states again, I never have and never will approve a new drug to an individual, but only to a large pharmaceutical firm with unlimited finances. And so, the fiercest fight in FDA history began.
Dr. Brzezinski's dealings with the FDA commenced in 1983. At that point, the FDA commenced a civil action to try to close the clinic and stop all patients from receiving the medicine.
Before the judge in this case had announced her ruling, the FDA sent her a letter warning her in advance, if this court declines to grant the injunction sought by the government, thus permitting continued manufacture and distribution of anti-neoplastons, the government would then be obliged to pursue other less efficient remedies, such as actions for seizure, also known as raiding his clinic and home, and condemnation of the drugs, also known as a propaganda campaign, or criminal prosecution of individuals, also known as throwing Dr. Brzezinski in prison. Regardless of these threats from the FDA,
The judge in the case basically said that he can treat anybody he wants in Texas, but he can't ship his medicine in interstate commerce. The FDA viewed that as a failure and told Dr. Brzezinski's at the time, his attorneys at the time, that they have other ways to get him.
Surreptitious astroturf methods are now more important to these interests than traditional lobbying of Congress. There's an entire industry built around it in Washington.
And then we found that they severely violated protocol. They did not comply at all with the protocol. On the top of that, patients were forced to stop the treatment with antioplastons because of massive fluid retention. And this is something which we don't see with antioplastons. Typical effect of antioplastons is dehydration, which means elimination of the fluids. The patients are losing a lot of fluids to the point that they have to drink a lot of extra fluid. We don't see increased fluid retention. I was curious why this could happen. I knew that the patients were receiving a lot of intravenous fluid, but then we learned that perhaps the fluid which they were receiving were not anti-neoplastons.
in October of 1995, the National Cancer Institute's Cancer Information Service issued a public statement for anyone inquiring about their clinical trials of anti-neoplastons. In it, they stated, because these studies were closed prior to completion, no conclusions can be made about the effectiveness or toxicity of anti-neoplastons.
And they're just trying to, you did that to yourself, basically, and now we're going to come in with this kind of treatments.
Yeah.
So
Well,
we're all responsible for our own destiny, in a way.
So when it comes to prevention and managing, I do want to talk about glutamate, the other fuel that you mentioned.
No, glutamine.
Yeah. The amino acid glutamine. But when it comes to managing glucose, there's there's our postprandial blood sugar. A lot of people these days are, they're wearing continuous glucose monitors, and there's, some have argued that we really have to mitigate these blood sugar spikes. But then, of course, there's also there's something different, and that is the chronically elevated glucose that you see in the setting of type 2 diabetes, right? The fasting blood sugar that's chronically elevated.
Right.
So how do we manage our glucose? Is it, again, do we all need to be on low carbohydrate diets, or is this ultimately, the concern about fasting blood sugar, which can be mitigated ultimately by a diet that doesn't necessarily exclude carbohydrates, but just keeps you in a state of energy balance?
Yeah, I think so. I think we have to blend. We're not going to go back and live like we did in the Paleolithic period, but we certainly have to be aware of, we built the glucose ketone index calculator, the GKI index, for cancer patients, basically so you knew if you had cancer, you knew how far you could push your blood sugars down and how high you get your ketones up, putting maximum pressure on the survival of the tumor cells. But a lot of folks took that, and healthy guys like you, young, healthy people, they're out there looking at their glucose ketone index saying, wow, look how low I got my GKI. Means that my mitochondria are going to be humming with energy efficiency. And that's true. But for the cancer patient, we need to bring the glucose ketone index down to kill the tumor cell. But at the same time, the elevation of the ketones makes our normal cells very, very healthy. Glucose is easily managed with diet and lifestyle. The glutamine issue is there's no diet that will target the glutamine. Glutamine is made by the body. Glutamine is an essential, and in some ways it's a very essential amino acid, necessary for our immune system, necessary for our gut, necessary for the urea cycle, but it's a fuel for cancer cells. Glutamine is not a risk factor for cancer, but if you have cancer, glutamine works with the glucose together, so they fuel together. So there's no diet that we can target glutamine. So we have to use specific drugs. And those drugs must be used with a great deal of sophistication. Because if you're too aggressive in targeting glutamine, you're going to harm your gut. You're going to harm your immune system. You're going to harm your urea cycle. You're going to make things bad. So there's where the knowledge base has to come in. So you need to know. That's why we developed the press pulse therapeutic strategy for managed cancer. You can press glucose constantly down, because we don't need glucose. We can substitute ketones for glucose. So we don't need glucose. We absolutely need glutamine. But we need it. We know that our normal cells need it and the tumor cells need it. So what we can do is we challenge the glutamine just briefly. And what that does, when you have a chokehold on the glucose, you challenge the glutamine just briefly, slaughters a lot of tumor cells. But we pull the glutamine off and give the glutamine back to the patient. Now, what that does is it restores the power of our immune system to pick up the dead corpses. But then we go back and hit them again, and we slowly degrade while keeping the rest of the body healthy.
After I decided to open my laboratory, the only funds available for me were loans from the banks, patients' fees, and payments from the insurance companies.
Could you stand for just a minute, Dr. Gardner? This is Dr. Harold Gardner. Now, is there anything about this that you find controversial? I mean, his treatment, does it have a good scientific background hypothesis and really controlled studies behind it?
Yes, as the science of investigation goes, Dr. Brzezinski's studies have been quite professional, certainly as creditable as most at Wayne State and the University of Michigan and others, which I'm tied to directly. The controversy is less in his approach on a therapy basis than it is his approach organizationally. And much of the medical and hospital industry operates as a very closed shop. And if you have ideas that might in one way or another jeopardize that economic base, you fall into disfavor very quickly.
This is the brain of an 8-year-old boy with a huge tumor most thought would kill him. He used Dr. Brzezinski's drug. Images of his skull taken 6 years later show the tumor has almost disappeared.
They're playing a role in their destiny.
Due to this reality, combined with the continued failed efforts of state and federal agencies in their attempts to stop Brzezinski from continuing to treat patients and expand his research, special interest groups have since launched a relentless propaganda campaign against Dr. Brzezinski and his supporters and patients in hopes that this game-changing innovation never reach the open market. And here's why. While most would assume that a breakthrough cancer treatment of this magnitude would be widely celebrated by the industry and encouraged for no other reason than its monetary worth, when one applies the logic and reason of the scientific method to this idea, this theory has no foundation or basis in fact. The primary reason that the cancer industry and its regulatory agencies fear the approval of anti-neoplastons is purely economical.
And the survival of their soul. Makes sense, right?
Yeah, it makes total sense. I mean, a lot of people...
not only makes sense, it's based on hard biochemical science.
Meanwhile, both the FDA and the Texas Medical Board are still trying to stop Brzezinski.
A carefully constructed narrative by unseen special interests designed to manipulate your opinion. A Truman Show-esque alternate reality all around you. Complacency in the news media combined with incredibly powerful propaganda and publicity forces mean we sometimes get little of the truth.
Dr. Brzezinski had MRIs of brain tumors known to be almost universally fatal, and it simply disappeared.
A Polish native named Stanislaw Brzezinski attended Lublin Medical University, where he graduated first in his class at age 24, and then received his PhD in biochemistry the following year. While undergoing his research to acquire his PhD, Dr. Brzezinski made a profound discovery. He found a strain of peptides in human blood and urine that had never before been recorded in biomedical research. As his curiosity in these peptides evolved, he made another profound observation. People who were inflicted with cancer seemed to lack these newly discovered peptides in both their blood and urine, while those who were healthy and free of cancer appeared to have an abundance of these peptides. Dr. Brzezinski theorized that if he could somehow provide a way to chemically extract these peptides from the blood and urine of healthy donors and administer these peptides to those with cancer, Perhaps it could be useful in treating the disease.
AstroTurfers seek to controversialize those who disagree with them. They attack news organizations that publish stories they don't like, whistleblowers who tell the truth, politicians who dare to ask the tough questions, and journalists who have the audacity to report on all of it. Sometimes AstroTurfers simply shove intentionally so much confusing and conflicting information into the mix that you're left to throw up your hands and disregard all of it, including the truth. Drown out a link between a medicine and a harmful side effect, say vaccines and autism, by throwing a bunch of conflicting paid-for studies, surveys, and experts into the mix, confusing the truth beyond recognition. Special interests have unlimited time and money to figure out new ways to spin us while cloaking their role. Surreptitious special interests have unlimited time and money to figure out new ways to spin us while cloaking their role.
About the other ways. In 1985, the FDA convened a grand jury to hear evidence to try to indict Dr. Brzezinski. In connection with that, they had a raid of his clinic where they seized 200,000 pieces of paper, including all of his medical records of all patients. A little difficult to practice medicine when you don't have medical records.
Obviously, they came out and they confiscated all of our medical records. And it took us about 12 years or 14 years to recover these medical records. In the meantime, we are permitted to make copies of the medical records in their office, but it was also the neglect of human well-being. We are treating very sick people. They took medical records, and we needed these medical records to really fight for the lives of these patients, but they took this away. They didn't care for these patients. The patients could die. They were not important.
They presented the evidence to the grand jury, no indictment. 1986, they come back, seize another 100,000 documents, no indictment.
I just have real trouble in knowing how much pain and what people go through with cancer. And since 1967, you've been saying, I can take care of that, and people are going, forget it, don't pay any attention, and you've gone outside the country and they say fine, and here we say country and they say fine, and here we say no. Are we that backward, doctor?
Yes. Well,
what do you mean? Yes. Are we that backward?
Dr. Kessler, I'm not a statistic.
We're frustrated. Their rights, constitutional rights, have been violated. This has got to end. My children are asking me, Daddy, what does the future hold? My one daughter wrote a letter to the president of this country and said, please don't pull the plug on my daddy. And that just broke my heart and broke my wife's heart.
My husband is a walking miracle. 16 months ago, the doctors told us there's nothing else they can do. And they told us to enjoy what little life he has left. Look at him. He biked 32 miles after being on Dr. Brzezinski's treatment for 2 months. And they're saying we can't have it?
I have a report from my family physician which tells how well I am doing. My tumors are leaving my body, and my condition is improving every day. Now the FDA is saying to me, no, your doctor is a criminal. He should be put in jail, and he needs to be shut down. This is criminal. I want the FDA to get out of our lives and stay out of her doctor-patient relationship.
Dr. Brzezinski has threatened legal action to halt these new admissions, and NCI has suspended recruiting, leaving the trials with just those scientifically unsatisfactory 8 patients.
This broadcast, the National Cancer Institute issued an internal memo to all of those involved in the anti-Neoplaston trials. For the record, the Clinical Trials Monitoring Service has been instructed not to send any anti-Neoplastons clinical trial data to Dr. Brzezinski, the Brzezinski Research Institute, or anyone inquiring about the anti-Neoplastons clinical trials. Any inquiries that may be related to the trials or Dr. Brzezinski are to be referred to the Associate Director, Dr. Michael Friedman. Friedman then taunts Brzezinski. I must convey my deep pessimism. We are in no way obligated to obtain your consent. Your insistence on dictating the manner in which we conduct or review these clinical trials is both presumptuous and inappropriate. The future of these trials rests entirely with the NCI, since our primary obligation is to the American public. Brzezinski responds, "Your letter of June 6 conveys pessimism. My letter conveys outrage. Patients were admitted against admission criteria. Their treatment was discontinued, and their lives were jeopardized for frivolous reasons. In spite of your promise, we never received any detailed data on these patients. There must be a reason why you are afraid to provide us with complete copies of medical records."
At least half a year before we force NCI to release some of this information to us.
Is incomprehensible by 99% of the people in the cancer field. They just, either they don't know about it, they don't want to know about it, or they can't understand it. And that's the question. That's the question. Why can't people understand? I think they definitely can understand it. Problem is, God forbid they do it. What happens if you do something like that? I mean, all of a sudden these people are not only do you get rid of your cancer, you get rid of your type 2 diabetes, cardiovascular disease at the same time. Oh my God. Oh, no. Can't do that, man. Cannot do that.
Well, there's
Neoplastons were FDA approved for just one cancer type, even the smallest and obscure of cancer types, like brainstem tumors in children, where anti-neoplastons hold the first cures in medical history, but only afflicts a few hundred children per year. This would mean that anyone of any age diagnosed with any type of cancer, like breast, lung, or liver, could legally insist their oncologist provide them with anti-neoplastons off-label. Given the gentle and non-toxic nature of these medications, most reasonable people would begin to opt for anti-neoplastons as a first line of defense against their cancer, instead of first choosing the outdated modalities of toxic, life-threatening chemotherapy and radiation. Since approximately 40% of all men and women will develop cancer in their lifetimes, the FDA approval of anti-neoplastons on any level will reap financial devastation to the medical industry and could send Wall Street into a downward spiral. Additionally, since these patented medications have been in FDA clinical testing for more than 20 years, theoretically, the patents have expired. But technically, they are still partially protected due to being in the limbo of FDA clinical trials. Once anti-neoplastons are FDA approved for market, the entity owning their patent rights will only have up to 7 years of cornering the cancer treatment market before these medications devolve into a generic drug. Once they become generic, like the antibiotic, their prices will plummet indefinitely, allowing any global drug company to produce and sell anti-neoplastons, effectively destroying the current high-profit paradigm that the cancer industry has relied on for more than 40 years. Due to this stark reality, special interest groups are making every possible attempt to derail the approval of anti-neoplastons, demonize their inventor, while relentlessly trying to confuse the public about the truth of this story and the invention of anti-neoplastons themselves. The primary weapon in this deceitful propaganda is what is defined as an astroturf campaign.